I will be going over the main concerns and issues presented in Henry Giroux's paper on teacher education and democratic schooling. Giroux describes a transformative intellectual as one who exercises forms of intellectual and pedagogical practice that attempt to insert teaching and learning directly into the political sphere by arguing that schooling represents both a struggle for meaning and a struggle over power relations. As one who is not only able to analyze various interests and contradictions within society, but who can articulate emancipatory possibilities and work towards their realization. He describes the characteristics of teachers who assume the role of transformative intellectuals as those who treat students as critical agents, question how knowledge is produced and distributed, utilize dialogue, and make knowledge meaningful, critical, and ultimately emancipatory. Currently, public school teachers' participation in the debate on education has been less than vigorous. There are various ideological and material conditions that contribute to teachers' passivity and powerlessness. The topic of teacher passivity makes me think of certain issues in the new teacher book by Kelly Sellis and Stephanie Walter, which discuss how teachers feel the need to effectively navigate the school system by conforming, especially during their first few years as teachers. The ongoing struggle for democracy. Giroux analyzes the dominant new conservative positions that have generated current educational reform, develops a rationale for organizing teacher education programs around critical view of teachers' work and authority, presents some programmatic suggestions for analyzing teacher education as a form of cultural politics, and argues for critical pedagogy that draws upon the many-sided conversations and voices that make up community life. Giroux states that the new conservatives have seized the initiative by framing their arguments in terse rhetoric that resonates with the growing public concern about downward mobility in hard economic times, that appeals to a resurgence of chauvinistic patriotism, and that reformulates education goals along elitist lines. These new reformers seem to imagine public schools as economic rather than political instrumentalities. They are cutting public schools away from social justice and political democracy completely and placing them into elite, corporate, industrial, military, and cultural interests. In the current state, there are various concerns. The concerns are that there is little concern about how public education could better serve the interests of diverse groups of students by enabling them to understand and gain some control over the social political forces that influence their destinies. We are seeing a shift away from teacher control of the curriculum and toward a fundamentally technicist form of education that is more directly tied to economic modes of production. Teachers are constantly confronting conditions such as overwhelming emphasis on qualification, the growing lack of control over curriculum and other aspects, and over aspects of their work, the isolation of their peers from their peers, the condescending treatment by administrators, and the massive layoffs of veteran teachers. Many of these issues are suppressing the teachers' voices and creativity. These less engaging, in place of developing critical understanding, engaging student experience, and fostering active and critical citizenship, schools are redefined through a language and policies that emphasize standardization, competency, and narrowly defined performance skills. The de-skillifying of teachers appears to go hand in hand with increasing adoption of management-type pedagogies. The less engaging the material, the more the teachers are going to have to control their students. Democracy in education is being reduced to a set of inherited principles and institutional arrangements that teach students how to adapt rather than to question the basic precepts of society. Critical learning and citizenship have been reduced to an elitist, Platonic notion of pedagogy in which the complexity of knowledge-power relation is held hostage by claim to the virtues of a reductionist notion of cultural literacy. Viewing schools as sites of social transformation. Schools need to be viewed as places where students should be educated to become informed, active, and critical citizens. Too often, power has been used to favor select groups of students over others. The hidden curriculum in schools works in a subtly discriminating way to discredit the dreams, experiences, and knowledges associated with students from specific class, racial, and gender grouping. Schools need to focus on educating students to question content and express themselves as critical citizens. The concept of excellence in schools is designed to benefit those who already have access to positions of status and privilege. Schools of education rarely encourage their students to take seriously the imperatives of social critique and social change as part of a wider emancipatory vision. What needs to be done? Students need to be educated in the languages of critique and possibility that will allow them not only to critically analyze the democratic and political shortcomings of schools, but also to develop the knowledge and skills that will advance the possibilities for generating curricula that cultivates a deep respect for a democratic and ethical based community. Education to create a politicized citizenry educated to fight for various forms of public life, informed by a concern for justice, happiness, and equality. Viewing public schools as democratic public spheres, schools need to be sites dedicated to self and social empowerment. They should be places where students learn the knowledge and skills necessary to create critical democracy, where they are given the opportunity to learn the discourse of public association and civic responsibility. Rethinking the nature of teacher education. Teachers should be required to know more than subject matter they will be teaching. They need a fundamental understanding of issues specific to the economic, political, and cultural nature of schooling itself. They need to be able to theorize in a language that includes but goes far beyond the limits of traditional disciplines. They need to develop approaches of research, methods of inquiry, and theory that are directly tied to the problems and the possibilities of schooling. Classroom life. It is often described as a cultural terrain that is, where a variety of interests and practices collide in a constant and often chaotic struggle for dominance. Many student teachers are teaching working class or minority students while lacking a well articulated framework for understanding the class, culture, ideological, and gender dimensions that inform classroom life. These teachers often view cultural differences as deficiencies rather than as strengths. Teacher education as cultural politics. Teacher education curriculum should create conditions for student self-empowerment and self-constitution as an active political and moral subject. Students need to broaden their understandings of themselves, the world, and the possibilities for transforming the taken for granted assumptions about the way we live. Students need to be able to interrogate and selectively appropriate those aspects of the dominant culture that will provide them with the basis for defining and transforming rather than merely serving the wider social group. Understanding the relationship between power and knowledge. Educators need to provide knowledge that empowers students to understand and engage in the world around them, as well as to exercise the kind of courage needed to change the social order where necessary. Language issues in schools. They are typically defined by technical and developmental concerns and is actively implicated in power relations that support the dominant culture. Language plays an active role in constructing reality by marking the boundaries of permissible discourse, discouraging the clarification of social alternatives, and making it difficult for the dispossessed to locate the source of their unease, let alone remedy it. European traditions of discourse and textual strategies are usually favored. History. A critical approach to history would attempt to provide student teachers with an understanding of how cultural traditions formed. What is conventionally taught overwhelming reflects the perspectives and values of the white middle class, in specific white middle class males. Social arrangements eliminate the histories and the voices of those groups marginalized and disempowered by the dominant culture. Teacher educators need to focus on the cultural meanings their students use to understand text. They need to understand that students from subordinate cultures bring their own set of experiences, as well as their own dreams, desires, and voices to the act of reading. The focus needs to be on how students produce rather than receive knowledge. Culture, the set of practice and ideologies from which different groups draw to make sense of the world. Teachers should offer insight on the political logic that underlies various culture and power relations. The common social relations are structured to produce forms of oppression and dependency. Culture studies should become the touchstone of teacher education. Critical pedagogy in the classroom. The issue of student interest and motivation is linked to dynamics of self and social empowerment, taking the problems and needs of students themselves as a starting point. Critiques the dominant forms of knowledge and social practices, assisting students to draw on their own voices and histories to provide them with a sense of identity, worth, and presence. The student experience. To ignore the ideological dimensions of student experience is to deny the ground on which students learn, speak, and imagine. Voice. The measure by which students and teachers actively participate in dialogue. The dominant school culture generally represents and legitimates the voices of white males from middle and upper classes to the exclusion of economically disadvantaged students, specifically or especially females from minority backgrounds. By creating active links to the community, teachers can open up their classrooms to its diverse resources and traditions. When communities are ignored by teachers, students often find themselves trapped in institutions that not only deny them a voice. Locus of citizenship, where students can debate, appropriate, and learn the knowledge and skills necessary to live in a critical democracy. I'm going to show you a video of a high school language arts teacher who has embraced the idea of democracy within the classroom.
not about disempower. There is an economy of power in education that involves an exchange. In a traditional setting, the keeper of all power, the keeper of all things, all passes, knowledge, information, assignments, grades, everything is hosted by that one main central person. And with that model in mind, whenever I ever tried to use it, was always met with a lot of difficulties in the classroom. Um, and so, this being my 8th year of teaching, what I've learned over the years is that the approach that I like to use is more of a democratic approach. Control isn't something that is demanded. Control is something that comes to building the floor and classroom communities. In this day and age where we're competing with MySpace, we're competing with text messages, internet on their cell phones, video games, and all the other lists of new things out there, we've got to be really good about what we're doing. And a 50-minute lecture just in this day and age with old curriculums that maybe students have difficulty in connecting to. It just simply isn't working in this time. It doesn't work when we live in a democracy to stand up front and tell kids what they need to know. Democracy is participatory in nature. It should be participatory in the classroom as well. So, with that kind of philosophy in mind, classroom management becomes a lot more easier to manage. Issues of discipline, acting out, those issues go down. Issues of participation, student success go up.
Going back to locus of citizenship, I wanted to quote something that Lisa Delpit wrote in Multiplication is for White People, Raising Expectations for Other People's Children. In her Picking Up the Broom chapter, she says the urgent need for demanding critical thinking of our students exists in all subject areas. Only those who are authentically and critically literate can become the independently thinking citizens required for any society's evolution. I feel that those are very strong words that describe or kind of summarize many of the topics that were presented in the article. Another quote from her book is on what a student responded when she asked about their type of school. She says, I asked how their school was different from regular public school. One responded that it was different because it was Afrocentric. What does it mean? I asked. It means that we learn how to think for ourselves. In regular public schools, you just take what the book says as truth. Here, we can question what the book says or what the teachers say as long as we have a good argument. I feel like more schools need to adopt this idea of allowing students to think for themselves, to venture out and to find responses. They might not always be the correct response, but if they have a valid argument, I feel we're already going in the right direction to get those students to thinking critically and can thereafter use those critical thinking skills to apply them to real life issues that they may face as democratic citizens in the United States. Here are the references that I used for this presentation. To Teach: The Journey of a Teacher by William Ayers, The Blackwell Guide to the Philosophy of Education by Blake, Miseducating Teachers About the Poor, A Critical Analysis of Ruby Payne's Claims About Poverty by Boomer, The Critical Pedagogy Reader by Dardner and others, Multiplication is for White People by Delpit, Reaching and Teaching Students in Poverty by Gorski, How Assumptions Affect Our Expectations by Hilkskimper, Rural Poverty and the Importance of Place Value by Kirby, Engaging Community Voices for More Democratic Schooling by Osterling, A Framework for Understanding Poverty by Payne, the new teacher book, Finding Purpose, Balance, and Hope During Your First Years in the Classroom by Solace, and Questions Behind the Questions of Vernacular Education, a study in literacy, native language, and English. Thank you.